Because my mother and my grandmother and my great-grandmother all had their children so young, my grandmother was only maybe 38 when I was born, and she was like in the wind. She was a nurse at the VA hospital in Brooklyn. Her name was Thelma, her maiden name Thelma Hardy, and at that point she was Thelma Onley. Onley's a big family name for us. And later in life, she became Thelma Davis after my grandfather died and she remarried. So she was kind of in the wind. She was, fly and fabulous and 40, and, we barely saw her except when my sisters and brothers and I would sometimes, because she lived very close to us, we would go to the train station and we would walk to the train station and meet her, and we would all yell, "Grandma, Grandma, Grandma." And she's like 45 years old. And it's like these three overgrown children just yelling and screaming your name. And she would always say, "Do you have to say Grandma so loud?" So I think in some ways her parents, her mother and father, were in many ways a much greater influence on me because I would spend my entire summer often with them in Charlottesville. And they were really kind of pillars of Charlottesville's Black society. First of all, they had been in the Charlottesville and the adjacent towns for many years, for many generations. They had been, their ancestors had been slaves there in the surrounding area. After slavery, my 3 times great-grandfather walked from the plantation where he was enslaved. He was only 16. It was in Gooch County, and it was the Peyton plantation, which was a huge plantation. Many people enslaved there, and Peyton is a very common name for African Americans in Virginia because of that. So my 3 times great-grandfather, Evans Payne, walked from Richmond, from the plantation to Richmond. And his family had been enslaved on the Payne plantation for at least 3 generations that he knew of. He had been a slave there, his parents and his grandparents. So that would have taken them back probably to the early 1800s, late 1700s. So we were part of the enslaved people of this country for many, many generations. So he walked to Richmond. He became a day laborer. And he always told this story, which my great-grandfather always told me, about how he learned to read. He was working and he found a piece of a book in some debris. And he would save his money, and he got a young girl, an 11, 12-year-old white girl, to teach him a word every day. And this is how he learned how to read. And he was always so proud of it. And my great-grandfather would tell me this story all the time, a story that he sat on his grandfather's lap and heard, about how he had learned to read from this piece of book. He ultimately was able to go to college, and then he received an honorary PhD, and he was a very esteemed, very famous minister, the Reverend Dr. Evans Payne. He was a contemporary of many of the civil rights leaders of that era. He's been written about extensively, and my family history has been documented extensively. And when he died, it was front page news in all of the Black newspapers in that part of the country because he had been the minister of his church for more than 50 years. And he was a very close friend and contemporary of Booker T. Washington's. And Booker T. Washington wrote about him quite a bit, and his big thing was financial solvency. So he started a savings and loan. So I came from quite a storied family, and I had a very good sense of kind of history of that family, and that we were very well-known, very respected people in that town. And everywhere I went, people would say, "Are you Miss Hardy's granddaughter?" And I would say yes, and everyone would point to me. So I really had this tremendous sense of my own place and self, which I think has carried me through the years.
Yeah. Was that any kind of pressure put on you to succeed in school or other accomplishments because of that history?
Absolutely, but not pressure in the way that I interpret your question. Pressure in the way of to live up to the model of these people. I mean, to think to not have been able to read until you were 16 years old, to have walked, you know, more than a day to find a job, to have done all of these things. It wasn't pressure in the sense of, Nina, you better do this. It was more pressure of, how can I live up to the model of these people? How can I be a person who's worthy of having been a Peyton and a Hardy and an Onley, when those things meant a great deal?